Right, well, welcome everybody to the Anne Frank Lecture 2012. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Anne Frank Trust as one of its founders and its executive director. Now, I can see that many of you here are supporters and friends of our charity and are very conversant with what we do. For those of you who aren't yet involved with our work, we were set up just over 20 years ago by family and friends of the late Otto Frank in order to honour Anne Frank and her memory by challenging all forms of irrational prejudice and hatred and promoting positive attitudes towards difference, responsibility and respect for others. We do this through our travelling exhibitions and educational programmes on the life and times of Anne Frank and relevant current issues. We visit schools, colleges, prisons and communities throughout the UK, targeting areas of social division and economic deprivation. We educate over 70,000 young people each year, many of whom go on to become our Anne Frank ambassadors, of whom we're extremely proud. And we know that Anne and Otto Frank would also be proud of them. We're delighted that the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism is partnering with us again this year. When I first approached the Master of Birkbeck, Professor David Latchman, to be our academic partner, he did not hesitate in agreeing, and we're extremely grateful to you, David, and to Professor David Feldman, Director of the Pears Institute. The Pears Institute is based at Birkbeck, University of London, and is the only centre of its kind in the UK dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism as well as other forms of racial prejudice and intolerance. Established just over 18 months ago, it's already achieved an international reputation for its innovative approach to exploring the connections between anti-Semitism and other racisms. As well as research and teaching, it has a busy programme of public lectures throughout the year. Both our organisations owe a huge debt to the Pears Foundation, as the foundation was crucial not only in establishing the Pears Institute, but also in the development over many years of the Anne Frank Trust. On behalf of both our organisations, I would like to thank the Anne Frank Trust's long-time patron, Professor Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, who not only had the idea of the annual Anne Frank Lecture, but also sponsors it through his family foundation, the Neerman Foundation. I'm delighted that Lord Parekh will close the proceedings this evening. Although we carry the responsibility of one of the world's most recognisable and symbolic names, a charity is all about its people. And our people are truly marvellous. So, if I may, just a few quick thanks to the organising team. Marcia Selwyn, who unfortunately is ill today and after all her hard work can't be with us. Julia Clarfield, Unity Sandasi and Lynn Winton at the Anne Frank Trust. Dr. Jan Davison at the Pears Institute and the team at the Institute of Child Health. Also to our media partner, the Daily Telegraph, who have done us proud by promoting this lecture in 2 features. Now, I look around and I see many of you who attended the inaugural Anne Frank lecture last year given by Simon Sharma. And just before I hand over to Professor Latchman to introduce our distinguished lecturer, I would like to say a personal thank you to Susan Greenfield for agreeing so readily and so enthusiastically to deliver the second Anne Frank lecture. I, for one, am hugely excited as her chosen topic is so, well, dare I say it, topical. And so,
and I think I should start actually by paying tribute to the person who has been the driving force behind the Anne Frank Trust for so many years and behind this lecture as well, which is of course Gillian, and to say what a pleasure it is for us in Birkbeck to collaborate with the Anne Frank Trust through the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And of course one of the delights is the calibre of the speakers who have chosen and who have agreed to give this Anne Frank lecture. Last year's inaugural lecture by Simon Sharma, which Gillian has already referred to, and today we're privileged to have with us Baroness Susan Greenfield to deliver the second lecture, or as she was referred to in The Independent a few years ago, the girl with all the brains. And of course that was intended, I think, by them to refer to her dissecting a rabbit brain as a teenager in order to find out how it worked. But I think it also refers, perhaps one could call it, the girl who studies all aspects of the brain, because of course she is a distinguished scientist, professor of pharmacology in the University of Oxford, a distinguished entrepreneur who has spun out 3 companies based on the relevance of her work to Alzheimer's, but also primarily now perhaps a distinguished public communicator of science, with a number of books with titles around the guided tour of the brain, the private life of the brain, and not perhaps as so many scientific communicators simply presenting dogma or accepted knowledge, but also being prepared to be controversial, as she has done with her discussions on the influence of modern technology, of internet addiction on the developing brain, particularly in adolescence. It may or may not be a coincidence that when I tried to open this Independent article on my computer, intrigued by the title, The Girl with All the Brains, it made my computer crash 3 times before I managed to open it. Fortunately, we are not dependent on that technology this evening. We have Susan Greenfield with us, and it's a great pleasure to invite her to deliver the second Anne Frank lecture. Thank you.
David, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Gillian. Of course I accepted this enthusiastically. Of course I did. This is a huge honour to be asked to speak, and in honour of such an iconic and special person. What I want to do is, I think in a way David's preempted part of my lecture, and that is to explore with you something that I think not just scientists, but anyone really is concerned with and fascinated with in equal measure, and that is the world, this unprecedented world of the 21st century, and the technology that's enriching our lives in so many ways, but at the same time, for the first time, possibly bringing unprecedented changes to the way we think and feel. And what we're going to do this evening is look and see, in the spirit of the Anne Frank lectures and the Anne Frank charity, in this high-tech, fast-paced, exciting world, is there still room for being human? And if so, how do we do this? And how do we minimize the threats to that? Okay, so what I'm going to do, because this is what happens when you have scientists, is you always have everything conveniently numbered. The key points will be numbered. So if people want to doze off, then their neighbours can nudge them when a number comes up, and you'll know that there's another section to the talk. So the first point I want to make is, this is the environment, in case you forgot what it looks like, that the environment is key. So let's have a think first about that. How do we differ from goldfish? I hope I don't offend any great goldfish lovers here, but let's be brutal. Goldfish don't have great personalities, do they? Let's be honest, they don't. I'm sure if you do have a goldfish, you don't keep it for its individual repertoire of behaviour. And if your children had a goldfish and the goldfish sadly were to die, while the child was at school, you could sneak off and buy another goldfish. Perhaps you've done this from the laughing. I can hear, perhaps this is a project of yours. Kid would come home and you wouldn't know any difference. Yeah? Now, you couldn't do that with pet cats or dogs, of course, and much as they might want you to, you certainly couldn't do it with their brothers or sisters. Now, why is this? Why is it that we are special and the goldfish isn't? Why is it that we have personalities, dare I say individuality, dare I say it's something unique about us, that the benighted goldfish doesn't have? Why is it that we as a species, although we don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong, why is it that we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet? Well, I think this is the clue to the answer to what makes us so special. And what makes us so special is not our hearts or our lungs or our liver, but I'm sure you can guess what it is that makes us so special, and it is, of course, our brains. So let's have a look at how we first started off life. This is the first 2 years of life, and I'd like to apologise to any neuroscience colleagues in the audience, or neurologists, if I speak in non-technical terminology, because I assume that most people here are not neurologists. Is that a correct assumption? Okay, right, the blobby bits, are the brain cells. Right? The stringy bits are the connections between them. And as you can see, that in the first 2 years of life, you're born with a brain the size pretty much of a chimp's brain, but unlike the chimp, our brains then expand hugely. Why? Not due to the growth of more brain cells, blobby bits, but due, as you can see, to the connections between them. Now, this means that even if you are a clone, that's to say an identical twin, you are going to be unique. And this is because we have the capacity, unlike the goldfish, even compared to a chimp, we have this capacity more than they. We have the ability to adapt to our environment, because what's going to happen is the environment is literally going to leave its mark on your brain. And it's going to do that by shaping and reshaping and updating and strengthening and sculpting the connections of your brain cells. So you are unique. For the 100,000 years we as a species have stalked the planet, people will have had hearts and lungs and livers just like yours. No one, not even your identical twin, has a brain like yours. And this is because if you have individual experiences, then guess what? You are going to become an individual. Now, this is something that we call plasticity. It doesn't mean to say the brain is made of plastic. It comes from the Greek plastisein, to be moulded or to mould. And what we're going to see is just one example, a very enchanting and I think intriguing one, of the plasticity of your brain, of the human brain. This is a wonderful experiment involving 3 groups of adult human volunteers. None at the time of the experiment could play the piano. It's a 5-day experiment. Now, if ever you get the chance to volunteer for such an experiment, let me give you a word of advice. Try and not be in the control group. Because they stared at a piano for 5 days. Not much else. I mean, I think they're allowed to sleep, but they didn't do much else. But there was a second group, and these guys and women learned 5-finger piano exercises. And what we're going to see in the brain scan is, even over 5 days, the astonishing change in the brain territory relating to the digits, even over 5 days. But there's another group, perhaps the most remarkable of all, a third group, and I'm going to keep you in suspense about them. Can I just ask, and I know you're not going to put your hands up because I never do, if there's philosophers lurking here in the audience. There's one who bravely owns up. It's only afterwards, sometimes in Q&A, although we're not having Q&A today, that philosophers reveal themselves with very technical questions. But this third group I would like to address to any philosophers in the audience, because I think it's particularly relevant to the kind of things that they're interested in. So let's look then. We're going to look at 3 groups now. We're going to look at the brain scans over 5 days as a result of either looking at the piano, playing the piano, or the mystery third group. So here we go. Here we have the control group, and as you can see, going from left to right over the 5 days, the brain is literally unimpressed. Nothing. These people, however, who learnt the exercises, can you see the astonishing change even over 5 days in their brain territory relating to their digits? But the most exciting group, for me, the ones that I was holding in suspense that I would love to discuss with philosophers, are these people who merely imagined they were playing the piano. Yeah, isn't that exciting? And we could talk about this slide all evening, frankly. I could stop the whole lecture here because it really does. As someone said to me once, it makes you think, the brain, doesn't it? And I thought, well, actually, that's kind of the point. Yeah. And as you can see, it makes you think, these brain studies. Any young person here who would like to be a neuroscientist, you can see the kind of exciting things, or even older people who want to be a neuroscientist, you can see the exciting issues that we kind of confront. Now, there's various things we can say about this. First is it shows how silly it is for that tired old dichotomy, that distinction of mental versus physical, of mind versus brain. I get so fed up going to parties when you meet people who are trafficking, as they would see it, and dealing with the exotic aspects of being human, with emotions and abstract ideas, and they regard people like me as dealing with the squalor of the biology of the brain, and the two never meet. Clearly, that is now outdated. Clearly, everything you do, everything you feel, everything you think has some provenance, some root, somehow, somewhere in the physical brain. Of course, we don't know how or where, of course, that's another issue. Clearly, you cannot divorce the two. So that's the first issue. The second is that clearly the impact here isn't the contraction of the muscle. It's the thought that has preceded it that's all important, hence the similarity between the mental and the physical practice. And what I've done here is given you a quote from a wonderful man called Hornikowitz, who invented or developed the therapy that is still in use today. He developed it in the 1960s for Parkinson's disease. Therefore, he was an expert on the generation of movement. And he came up with this brilliant quote: "Thinking is movement confined to the brain," as you can see. Thinking is movement confined to the brain. And that's a quote I want to return to later. If I don't say it and I look like I'm wrapping up, can someone say, what about that quote, please, to me? Because I think it's relevant. But I'll leave this with you as illustrating very beautifully here the astonishing adaptability of your brain. So just think your brains have changed since you've been sitting here. Well, I hope they have, anyway, unless you've fallen asleep. Yeah. Every moment you are alive, your brain is changing. So let's think about that. Now, in order to understand what's happening, we have to turn, I'm afraid, to subjects where we can look inside the brain, more specifically rodents. And this is from my own laboratory. These are 2 slides from my own laboratory, where we want to see how is it that this kind of thing can change the brain. Now, obviously, you can't ask a rat to play the piano, but you can put a rat in what's called an enriched environment. Enrichment for a rodent doesn't mean to say they come to the Anne Frank lectures and have hopefully stimulating discussions and so on. But as you know, they're highly exploratory creatures, and you can therefore give them a stimulating, interactive environment by supplying them with lots of sort of branches and wheels and so on. Look how happy this rat looks. He's having such a lovely, lovely time here. He's really enjoying himself, as they all are. But this one, I think particularly fond of this one. He looks really happy. Now, if you look at a single brain cell from a group that weren't so fortunate that were actually allocated to the isolated, simple lab cages, and look at a brain cell from an experiment compared to animals from an enriched environment, then you'll see something very interesting. So this is a brain cell from an animal in the so-called isolated condition who was living the life, I'm afraid, of the normal lab rat, where you have food and water but not much else. And I know that most of you are not familiar with this, but let me just orientate you. This blobby bit here is the main part of the brain cell. The branches here are what I'd like you to focus on, because that's where you're going to see a difference when I show you the next brain cell from one of these guys, or similar. And as you can see, I hope that although the blobby bit is pretty comparable, the branches have changed. The branches are much more extensive. Now, how has this happened, and why is it interesting or important? Well, let's take it step by step. Everyone here is familiar with the phenomenon of use it or lose it, how when you take physical exercise, the relevant muscle groups will get strong and large, and those that do not exercise will not prosper so well. They may even atrophy and weaken. We know that if you make parts of your body work, they will respond by being more effective and efficient. And so it is with a brain cell. If you place a brain in an interactive, stimulating environment, as this simple environment with even rodents, then what will happen, because the brain cell is made to work harder, like your muscle, it will grow, but the way it grows is to grow branches. Now, why is that important? Well, if you grow more branches, you are increasing the surface area of your brain cell, which means you can make more connections. Because, very simply, there's more space there for all the many, up to 100,000 brain cells that want to connect with you. They can come in, and there's more space for them to do that. So just take it step by step. A stimulating, interactive environment makes brain cells work hard, which enables them to grow more branches, which increases their surface area, which means they can enhance their connectivity. So very, very straightforward. So why is that relevant to the human condition? Well, let's think about it. You're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, into booming, buzzing confusion. And when you're little, when you're a baby, when you're just born, all you can do is evaluate the world in terms of the raw senses that impinge on you. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. All you can do is evaluate things in, of course, abstract senses, funny smells and colours and shapes and vision, and they don't mean anything. They're just flooding in on you as a little baby. But just imagine, as the weeks turn to months, if the same visual pattern presents itself again and again. And let's say the same erstwhile abstract visual pattern is accompanied by certain smells and colours and textures that are the same, then, like with the piano players, associations will form in your brain that are special to you in relation to this thing that you're constantly presented with. Now, say this thing is your mum's face. Slowly, slowly, as the weeks turn to months, this erstwhile conglomerate of sensation will become your mother. She will mean something to you by virtue of the associations that are now forged in your brain, but not in anyone else's. You will shift from evaluating the world in purely sensory terms now to what we call cognitive, after the Latin cogito, to think. So what happens then is gradually, as these senses enable you to make sense of the world, so it ceases to become abstract and sensory, and it becomes meaningful. So here's an example. I doubt if anyone here will recognize, I hope you still recognize me, that was a while ago, this photo. You won't recognize any of these other people. You will see them as generic middle-aged men in suits and ties, I imagine. Which is no dishonor to be that. But for me, this photo is very special. It actually marked a very special day, actually, when we signed an agreement with the university, which in itself was remarkable because of all the problems we've been having. Sadly, one of these people is now dead. Others are close friends. But I know these people well. They mean a lot to me as individuals, and that day means a lot to me because it marked a milestone in our research. It means nothing to you. They're just generic. You could give me or show me similar pictures of very special days and very special people to you that I will see as generic men, women, and children by virtue of the personalization of our associations and our connections, which enable you to see the world in a unique way from a unique perspective. I always remember when I dissected a human brain for the first time in the lab in Oxford, and one of my guests here actually was here at the same time. And I remember thinking, if I wasn't wearing surgical gloves and a bit of brain dislodged under my fingernail, what would that be? Would that be the bit that somebody loved with, or would it be a memory? Would it be a hope? Would it be meaning, the meaning of a person? And it's an astonishing, again, I speak to anyone contemplating a career in neuroscience as to how exciting it can be. Anyway, so here you are. You've shifted from this one-way street of how sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright, to now having associations which enable you to say, oh, that's mum. Oh, that's the day we did this or that. And of course, every time you have that experience, it will update and upgrade the existing association. So you're going from a one-way street to a two-way street. This constant dialogue between your brain and the environment, which will constantly update and change and upgrade how you're seeing the world. And every time it does that, makes you even more unique, even more special, because there's more and more associations that have accrued as you're living your life. So, connections, I'd like to suggest to you, give an ever deeper meaning to how you see the world. It's no longer the booming, buzzing confusion. It's now a meaningful place to be. Let's think about that a little bit more. If you show a child, a small baby, a wedding ring, it may well be attracted or find that an interesting object because it's gold and shiny. You can roll it. You might try and put it in his mouth, of course. You can stick things through it. It could be, just by virtue of its sensory properties, it could be an object of interest to the child. Now, as the child grows, from baby to an older child, they will learn that it's special, that this is something called a ring that you put on fingers, and it's supposed to be worn on fingers. And as the child grows even older, they'll learn that wedding rings are on special fingers, and wedding rings are different from other rings. And eventually, perhaps that child will have a wedding ring of his or her own. That wedding ring, rather like with my friends at the time of signing an agreement with the university, that wedding ring, which you will see as just the same old wedding ring, that wedding ring for that person will have so many associations and be so unique and special. It will have a value and a significance that no other wedding ring will ever have. That might change, of course, as one goes from honeymoon through to divorce, and then again that will change. So objects and people then become personalized to you, special to you. That changes over time. And this is because your brain is changing over time, because every experience you have will be imbued and shot and cross-referencing with other associations and values. So ever more complex and exciting. Connections also do something else for you. Now, had I come on the stage this evening dressed up like this as a ghost, I doubt if anyone would have been frightened. But let me assure you that if there was an Alzheimer patient, and you're sure they would be frightened and confused, as would a very small child. Why is that? It's because you are not frightened by the notion of someone dressed up as a ghost going woo, 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 because you know very well it's a grown-up dressed up in a silly costume. A small child, and indeed an Alzheimer patient, will take the world at face value. They will be frightened by something they cannot understand. They won't have the checks and balances that you have because of your connections. So this means that whilst you can understand the world, you can not be frightened by something because you can actually see what's going on. You can, by virtue of your prior experiences, relate it to understanding the current experience. Someone who is in the here and now, and we'll come on to Alzheimer's in a minute, but children won't be able to do that. That's why they'll be scared. They'll be scared because they don't understand it. There's also a final example of connection. So we've looked at the personalization of people or objects. We've looked at how it gives you the checks and balances for understanding the world. Why am I talking suddenly about a candle? Well, it actually prompts me to tell a story that doesn't put me in a very good light, but I think it's worth risking my reputation as a childminder to tell this story. I have a brother who's much younger than me, and in David's kind introduction, he omitted to say that when I did chop up a brain, I recruited the services of my much younger brother, who was at the time about 3 years old when I was 16. But that was only the start. Torture ensued in many forms, such as putting his water pistol in the oven and letting him see the oven melt the water pistol. That was particularly, and he still remembers this even now. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning how very bad I am at relating to small children was part of the torture also was I thought it was quite fun to force him to learn Shakespeare when he was 3. And so he learnt the very famous line from Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. And as someone once said, that must have gone down a storm in playgroup to have a 3-year-old going in, shaking their head, saying, oh, tomorrow and tomorrow, this petty pace. And so anyway, as you'll know, that passage then goes on, out, brief candle, life is but a poor player. Now, had you said to him, Graham, that being his name, what does it mean? Do you understand out, brief candle? He might have said, well, I have a candle on my birthday cake and I blow it out. What he wouldn't have said is, well, actually, it's a metaphor for death, because that's what it is, of course, the notion that the extinction of a candle is parallel to the extinction of life. So to truly understand this wonderful passage from Shakespeare, to truly understand it, you have to have enough neuronal infrastructure, enough conceptual frameworks to be able to see the connections of one idea to another. So connections then give you a significance of people and objects. They enable you to understand what is happening and not being frightened, and they enable you to see and think symbolically, all of which is very important. So I mentioned Alzheimer's. How does that relate to Alzheimer's? Well, you can imagine with Alzheimer's, what happens is that you actually go backwards in time. Here we have the human brain cell showing the embryo, the fetus, the early postnatal, and the mature brain cell, characterized by this wonderful proliferation of the branches. But if, and it is an if, sadly you are a victim of dementia, and it's a disease of older people, but it is not, and I would like to stress, it is not a consequence of old age, it's a disease of older people. It can be, but it is a disease. If, sadly, you fall victim to this, you can see that what happens is the branches retract so that you have less ability to make connections. So, in a sense, you're recapitulating childhood. So what is happening here is you're going back into, sadly, the booming, buzzing confusion. And so an Alzheimer person, I don't know if anyone in this room has their lives touched by this devastating illness, by caring for someone who they loved, you will know that what happens is the person still feels the joy of the sun on their face or the taste of an ice cream, but they can't understand things, they get confused and frightened, and therefore very disorientated at any change in routine, because they don't have that neuronal infrastructure, which is the birthright of the human adult, to be able to evaluate and navigate their way around the world, for the world to have a meaning that enables us to do so well in it as we have done up until now. I'd like to suggest to you that the mind is not some airy-fairy alternative to the squalor of the physical brain. It is actually the personalization of that brain through the unique dynamic configurations of your neuronal connections, driven in turn by experiences that only you have had. Only you have had these experiences. So here we are living our lives. This is downtown Oxford, as some people like to think. And I like this particular picture because everyone is doing their own thing. As in real life, everyone is on their own trajectory, as we all are. We've all got a past, we've all got a present, hopefully we've got a substantial future. But we're all on a journey, all of us on a separate journey that is unique, that has never in the history of time ever happened and never will again. And what happens is you have one thing relating to something else, relating to something else. I'm sure most people in this room have passed an exam. Now, it may be you subsequently failed exams. It may be you didn't make the most of what you'd studied. It may be it put you off exams forever. It may be that was the start of your career. It doesn't matter. No one can take away from you that you passed that exam. You can't unpass the exam. And that passing of the exam had ramifications and had cause-effect, knock-on, domino effect that is unique to you, that's part of your life story, And that is happening all the time. Events are happening which have consequences. Actions have consequences, therefore have meaning. And this is what makes you the unique person upon which the neuronal brain is embedded. So that is what makes you you. So here we have now number 2, if you want to wake up, if you've been sleeping, the options. What are the options, therefore, given the flexibility but vulnerability of the human brain to the environment? Let's just very briefly look at some of the options for becoming who we become. Now, sadly, in the history of time, as we know, the 20th century is absolutely bedeviled with these terrible movements, which I would call the anyone scenario, where here people, for reasons that are very hard to understand, gave up being individuals and blindly followed mass movements. One theory for this that you may have come across is that of someone called MacLean. Now, Paul MacLean, was working in the middle of the 20th century, and he was horrified by the Nuremberg rallies, but he was trying to understand what it was about humans that led them to be like this, that led them to be, as he saw it, very mindless. He posited that the human brain, based on the anatomy that we know, was like this. And as you can see, this is the back of the brain, this is the front. As you can see, it's like layers of an onion anatomically, and evolution has added more layers. So indeed, the most core part is the most basic part, which he called the reptilian brain. Layered around it is the mammalian brain, and then you have the primate brain, as he saw it, as the kind of crown of creation. And he argued that the idea was that the behavior of people when they're mindless, like in the rallies, was because this was all inhibited and the reptilian brain was unleashed in some way. Now, the problem I have with that, and here we have primitive brain, just in case you wonder what a reptile looked like, here we are, rational brain and so on. These are crudely analogous to any devotee of Freud, to the id, the ego, and the superego. So that was his theory of why people behave like this and why they subscribe to a collective sort of identity. But I have a problem with this idea, because it's not as if people at the rallies were unbridled in their emotions, as in France, you have crimes of passion, the crime passionnel, or like in road rage, where in this atavistic reptilian way, you just lash out and you're angry. No, the Nuremberg rallies didn't lash out at anyone. We all know they were very targeted. They were telling a story. They weren't just mindless reptilian rages. And for that reason, I would challenge MacLean's theory and suggest to you another theory, and that is that we are not actually succumbing here to unbridled passion, but to a story. The David and Goliath story is one of the most popular. And doesn't this sound familiar? The poor, oppressed, righteous person oppressed by the evil conspiracy. And people buy into this even now with some of the fundamentalist movements, this notion that one has some kind of narrative of the poor, oppressed person who's right, who needs to fight back against the evil ones. So this was the idea. I don't know how many people are familiar with this book. It was a brilliant book. It was written actually in the interwar years by Sebastian Haffner. That's a nom de plume. He actually wasn't Jewish, but he was very sympathetic to the Jewish cause. And he actually fled to England just before war was declared. And in this book, which actually has become a bestseller now in Germany, what he suggests, why it was so popular, why the Nazis took such hold in Germany, was because they gave a narrative, they gave a story, they gave people an identity at a time when after the First World War they lacked this identity. And what he suggests is that people like an identity. In this case, it's a collective identity, of course. It's an anyone. You can be anyone. It doesn't matter who you are. You're part of the big movement, but that movement has a story to tell. I would recommend this book, I say, which is a fascinating read. And I think he wrote it and then died, and his son discovered it in the attic. And he didn't know when he wrote this book what the outcome of the Second World War was. And it's, I think, all the more impressive for that. Okay, so the alternative then to being anyone, where you've given up your individuality, is to be someone. We all want to be someone. Now, this is the nephew of Freud, a man called Bernays, who's, you may be familiar with, the father of modern advertising. And he it was who tackled the knotty problem of how to get people to buy things that they might want, even though they didn't need them. And one of his tasks, as shown here, was how to get young women to smoke. We're talking here about the 1920s. Yeah? How could you get a young woman to smoke? Clearly she didn't need to, and culturally that wasn't the norm. What he did very cleverly was to say it would say something about you. So what he did was have attractive young women smoking and say this is the torch of freedom. The cigarette would stand for freedom, and that would be the appeal. So this notion that if you own something, it will say something about you, it will give you a status, is echoed still today. And just for fun, I Googled on the slogan, as individual as you are, and look what comes up. Everything. If you want to be individual, you can have a bracelet, you can have a kitchen, you can have evening dress, you can have face pads, you can have a toy. All these things make you individual, or do they? You may be familiar with this book by Oliver James, Affluenza, where he argues that the option of people trying to find an identity by owning things that will, quote, say something about them, how often have you heard that, actually leads, as you can see here, to depression, anxiety, addiction, and ennui. Very, I think, attractive book. So we're not doing very well here, are we, with the anyone or the someone options for identity. The third option, which I really want to focus on, is what we could call the nobody scenario, which I think really is characteristic of today's society. And will these current technologies change us? Now, I gather even this morning on the radio, there was someone saying, contrary to dogma and contrary to what everyone thinks, it's not bad and so on. And this is really important for debate, because my own view is that if you have a brain with the evolutionary mandate to adapt to the environment, if the environment is changing, how can the brain not change? And that's what I'd like to explore with you, as to, are we going to be cyborgs like this, or can we think of something more palatable? Okay, now you may be familiar with nanotechnology. Notice, incidentally, ladies in the audience, notice how the scientist is always portrayed. They're always portrayed as, people of dubious sartorial taste, with bald-headed men with white coats and gloves, always, and you have a woman doing it. Anyway, the whole point of this slide, apart from me talking about women in science, is nanotechnology, you can probably infer from this, is the science of very small, engineering on the scale of a billionth of a meter. Now, how will this change our lives, and will it change our lives as technology, given in mind that the environment is so important to us? Well, here you can see nerve cells growing on integrated circuits, astonishing. And this is here and now, this is not any futuristic invention. Here you see brain cells, and you see their branches, and this is a circuit board. Astonishing. Now, or is it? Actually, the two are very closely related, because nerve cells have had the whole of evolution to become brilliant electronic components. They have, for the engineers here, they have brilliant capacitive properties, and silicon and carbon work very well together. And as you can see here, this gives actually pause for thought to people that were brought up to distinguish things using carbon and things not using carbon. You can see here, I hope, how these brain cells, or these cells, are flourishing. This is from the work of someone called Peter Fromhertz at Munich, how they're flourishing on a circuit board. So could we have neurochips? Well, if you look here, you can see these are silicon picket fences on a circuit board, and like Day of the Triffids, you can have a brain cell plopped in the middle, and then if you look down on it, you can see here, these are the cells, and they're surrounded, they're flanked by these silicon picket fences, and then they're all hooked up together, forming a very crude array. Now, this is happening now. This is nothing to do with conscious computers, but it's everything to do with blurring the boundaries between biology and physics, everything to do with those old distinctions again being challenged. How can it affect us? Obviously, one could talk about nanotechnology for a long time. We're worried about the brain, or interested in the brain. What can we say about the brain? Well, if you can have brains on chips in this way, could you have chips in the brain? Answer is yes. And this is some pioneering work by Miguel Nicolailes, a Brazilian who's now based at Duke University, who's done some astonishing work with quadriplegic patients, people who are paralyzed from the neck down. And what he's been able to do, as shown here, is to actually capture the electronic signature that precedes a movement. You see, that's the all-important. Remember with the muscles, with the piano playing, thinking is movement confined to the brain. You take that thinking, in his case, you put it into a computer, so that next time you generate that same thought, that desire to move, the computer recognizes that and generates the movement of an artificial limb. This is astonishing work, and he's really a groundbreaking scientist, showing Miguel Nicolailes, Nicolailes, Nicolelis, I think, Miguel, and he's at Duke University. And as you can see, this is really challenging that frontier of thought and movement. It's really showing how, with miniaturized devices, you can start to monitor what's going on, not just in In the body, I mean, people have said, imagine going to the bathroom and cleaning your teeth and detectors in your toothbrush picking up the fact you might have tooth decay, and the toothbrush or the mirror says to you, you better watch out, you could have gum disease, you'll lose all your teeth in 10 years' time. Or you urinate in the loo and the lavatory pan speaks to you and it says, oh, you may have diabetes. It makes going to the bathroom even more hazardous than usual. So imagine doing that, but even more astonishing is when such technology can also be related to the CNS and how that relates to that private interface between a movement and a thought. Okay, so this is, I thought I'd include this because it's quite from Ian Pearson at British Telecom, a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless, I think we should be aware of it, showing evolution. Here we have Homo habilis 1.5 million years ago, our ancestors. We then stood up, Homo erectus. We then had the Neanderthals, whom everyone's heard of, but they kind of died out, as you can see, in favour of Homo sapiens, which is us, and that was 1.5 million years ago. But now look at the fate that awaits us, according to, I think some of my detractors probably think I'm this, Homo sapiens Ludditus, probably think that's me. And you can see here, in favour of Homo machinus, who's obviously going to take over in a brief 200 years, which I don't, who knows. But the reason I show that, I think Ian Pearson just did that tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's worth bearing some thoughts about when we think about our interfacing with technology in this way. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the term transhumanism. Transhumanism is this idea that we can enhance our brain and body processes by virtue of technology, whether it's the physical or biomedical sciences. It does, of course, beg the question, why we'd want to do that, but nonetheless it's been going, as you can see, for a long time. This is a fanciful idea of how science could redesign the human body. More recently, of course, we've been seeing astonishing change in robotics, and here we have the pinnacle of civilization, the cyborg. And more seriously, foreign policy actually described this as one of the world's most dangerous ideas. So it's something that we can't sweep under the carpet, we need to think about. It's this new idea, this new thought of, again, trying to improve, trying to be better than other people, trying to be... but it does beg the question why. I don't think Shakespeare or Einstein or Mozart would have, on a qualitative way, stood up in competition. But what made them so special is they were unique. Not that they were better at this or better than that. They were unique people with unique things to say. And I think this kind of notion that you can just enhance your memory or enhance your movement or enhance your perceptions is going to make you a more able person, I would question. But nonetheless, it's an idea that's out there that does get visited, as you might imagine, with the technology. Very briefly, biotechnology. What is that holding for us? Okay, well, this is what's going to happen to us all here, traditionally. This is, there we go. Just very briefly, and I apologise to any biotechnologists in the audience, as we know, health is on the increase. A little girl or a boy born nowadays probably has about a 1 in 3 chance of living to 100, thanks to pharmacogenomics, where we can get better genetic profiling, thanks to stem cell technologies, thanks to straightforward pharmacology, going from 400 to 4,000 drug targets. Everyone acknowledges, and we know that in our very privileged society, we have every chance to live a longer and healthier life. We'll leave the brain to one side, but below the eyebrows, everything is looking very optimistic. And whether you like it or not, and I don't want to get too high-minded about this, if you are healthier, you look younger. And we know that some of these technologies can be applied to cosmetic purposes, and the boundary is very blurred. For example, stem cell technology can be applied to male pattern baldness, for example. But I don't want to be too snooty about this. I think that the two go very closely together. What people look like impacts on how they feel. And so, therefore, we should acknowledge that as we are living longer and healthier lives, we're all going to probably look healthier and possibly not necessarily younger, but more the same age all the time. And again, with the technologies, cosmetic technologies for plastic surgery and the like being more the norm, what I worry is that we'll become more standardised in what we look like, and anyone with ears sticking out or, misshapen features in some way will be feel that they're being coerced into having a standardised face. That's another story. Reproductive status has changed. Soon it will be possible not just to freeze a woman's eggs, but to thaw them so that a postmenopausal lady could have children. And eventually it might be possible to extract the DNA from any cell in the body, combine it with anyone else's. And as long as you had IVF, anyone of any age or sexual orientation could then have a child. Another thought. Work. Now, this is the most sensitive issue of all. I've predicted long and hard that the government would try and extend our working life and raise the pension age. And soon they'll get onto the idea that work stimulates the brain, and it's good for you to work and not to take your pension, probably. So eventually, perhaps we'll all be working anyway. So one can imagine that this erstwhile compartmentalization of the generations will be blurred, that you'll grow up and you'll be healthy all your life. You'll look pretty standardized, and regular features all your life. You'll be able to reproduce all your life. You'll work all your life, and then you will die. So, there we are. No, this is a long way off, I think, but I'm not promoting it as an ideal, but that is where some of the logical progression could be. Now, what will that do to how you see yourself and how you see the world? These are things that we do need to think about. Okay, next point. The environment of the screen, which is what I really want to focus on, is unprecedented in changing how we think and feel. This is my contention to people that say everything is just fine and we've always had the printing press or the car or the fridge. We haven't had technology like this that is a means to that's an end, not just a means to an end. So let's think about, for your children and your grandchildren, what a cyber culture might mean. This is just one of many statistics coming out at the moment, and I just draw attention to this. Look at this. Between a child's 13th and 17th years of age, over half of them are spending 30-plus hours a week in recreational use of digital technologies. So that's 4 to 5 hours a day. 4 to 5 hours a day. Not going for a walk, not giving someone a hug, not feeling the sun on your face. And to people that say everything is fantastic, what no one can deny is that you can only have so many hours in the day. And if you're doing excessively or obsessively one type of activity for a large amount of time, then clearly there's other things that you won't be doing. And that's what I think we need to address. This is a very good book, as it was written about 5 years ago now, and I want to show that I'm not a Luddite by promoting this. Its name speaks for itself. It says why screen cultures can be good, and one of the things it says is that you have better sensory motor coordination, better working memory, and higher IQ scores. So I was just told this evening that the escalation in IQ scores that up until now has characterized our societies over the last decades has now actually plateaued or in fact decreased. But suffice it to say, as Stephen Johnson says, just because you have a high IQ, this could be well related to rehearsal of computer games all the time, because it's the same skill. You have to have a mental agility that looks for patterns and connections and gets to a specific answer in a unit time. So if you then do an IQ test and you've been rehearsing, remember, you use it or you lose it. The brain will adapt to whatever it's being asked to do all the time. If you're in an environment of computer games, then perhaps not surprisingly, you might be good at IQ tests afterwards. But just because IQ scores have risen, have we seen an increase in insight into the economic woes of the world? Or the Middle East crisis? Have we seen a dramatic increase in symphony writing or brilliant novels? No, I don't think we have. So just because you can process information does not mean to say you have knowledge. There's a world of difference between giving appropriate responses to stimuli and understanding things around you and being creative and imaginative in how you interpret and understand the world around you. So I don't want to disparage IQ tests, but let's remember there is more in our cognitive toolkit as humans than just that. So let's unpack some of the cyber culture. First of all, social networking. What can we say about social networking? Well, when you first meet someone, I don't know if you're aware of this, but words only actually have about 10% of impact. Eye contact and body language take up most of the impact you'll have. And we all know that you can look someone in the eye. If you do that, you really spook them, unless you're, of course, madly in love with each other. And sort of stare someone in the eye really frightens them. And if you don't look someone in the eye at all, that's equally unpleasant to do. So eye contact is a very subtle skill that we learn, as is interpreting and body language. Voice tone, you don't have to speak a foreign language to know if someone's angry or happy, according to their tone, their rate, and their volume. That's also very important. No one has quantified pheromones, these sneaky chemicals that we subconsciously smell. And perhaps most important of all is physical contact. My dad died in February of last year, in 2011, and I'm sure, sadly, many of you may have been in scenarios where you feel completely in pieces. And you will know that the most important thing is someone just to put their arm around you and say, I'm sorry, or just to hug you, even without saying anything. And how different that is from someone tweeting, sorry about your dad. No, it doesn't quite do the same thing. Yeah? So we know that physical contact is a very powerful and important way of communicating that you need to learn. You need to learn where and how to touch who and when, on what occasion. Hugely important, very culturally related. Now, eye contact, body language, voice, pheromones, and physical contact, guess what? They're not available on Facebook. So, whilst someone like my now widowed mum, who's 85, I would welcome her being on Facebook. I think that might be stimulating and interesting for her to learn and do. If you take a young brain with the evolutionary mandate to adapt to an environment, and that environment is persistently and obsessively engaged in social networking through this medium, how will they learn eye contact and body language and when to contact and when to hold someone? And that's what concerns me. Will this lead to a decline in empathy, possibly? Now, we know that autistic people who have an impairment in empathy for others, they are very comfortable on activities such as Second Life. Why might this be? And I was speaking just earlier this afternoon to the mother of an autistic child, and she agreed. She said, yes, when we go on the computer, we're all not using empathy. We're not looking at body language. We're not seeing someone blush. We're not picking up on those subtle signs. We're not hugging someone. What you see is what you get. Movements speak louder than words. So could it be this is the great leveler, and that when we are on the screens, we are not using our empathy skills? And if that is the case, what will that do? And this is a study from Michigan State University over the last 30 years, where, as you can see, in 1,400 college students in surveys, they've shown a decline in empathy. This has been particularly accelerated in the last 10 years. The rise of the so-called digital native, the person that's completely at home with computers. Now, I know that someone could say that doesn't prove it's due to the screen, and one could have said the same thing in the 1950s with saying that people hadn't proved that smoking was linked to lung cancer, and of course you then need to do the epidemiology. But trends such as this surely demand epidemiological and further investigation. That's all I'm saying. What does that say about our identity? This is a picture of identity, by the way, I just fancifully plucked from them. What does that say about who you are if you're constantly connected to others? And there's a very good book by someone called Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, a psychologist who argues the more connected you are, paradoxically, the more isolated you will feel. Because when you're on Facebook, you glamorize yourself. I gather I'm not on it, but you make sure your picture is the best one possible. It might be doctored to make yourself look even more attractive. You give yourself a lifestyle where it's endless parties and endless friends. And the more you do that, the more isolated and lonely and misunderstood you feel. So here we have the history of blogging, 1999. I just have to tell someone about this thing my cat did today. 2004, oh my God, cat pictures. YouTube, 2005, moving cat pictures. And then again, the pinnacle of civilization, Twitter. 1 p.m, cat sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently, getting worried. I don't know how many people do this kind of thing. Now, let's just analyze this. Why would people be interested in the minutiae of your day? What was very sad was an example I give of when I was in the States, when I was sort of watching, I was away, and I was watching BBC World, of a picture in the States of these girls who were in a Hollywood film set, teenage girls, and they were actually, for the first time, sitting inside the restored vehicle, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And the reporter said, how do you feel sitting inside Chitty Chitty Bang Bang? You know what they said? Not, I feel happy or sad or let down or nostalgic. No, they said, this is Facebook worthy. First thing they said. So are we entering a world where people live for the eyes of others, in the eyes of others, where they feel the need to constantly read out everything they're doing? And why would they want to do that? Doesn't it remind you a bit of a kid? Look at me, mummy, I'm putting on one sock. Look at me, I'm putting on the next sock. Because you don't look at me. If you don't look at me, how do I know I exist? So could people that obsessively tweet be in some kind of existential crisis, I wonder? And the Biz Stone, who was one of the co-founders of Twitter, famously about a month ago, actually said he was concerned that Twitter wasn't being used for the purpose he intended. It was now becoming an end in of itself, a culture in and of itself. And I find that not the technology and the use of it is fine, but it's the obsessive nature in which it's being used to the exclusion of other things. So could we now be looking at reduced empathy and a less robust identity? Okay, effects of gaming. What can we say about game? Well, obviously much. These two little boys are not playing a computer game with each other. They're playing with a computer. And again, a trend that I think needs to be explored is this one. You may not recognize methylphenidate, but if I tell you methylphenidate is the generic name for Ritalin, a drug used for attentional problems, you can see the escalation in prescriptions for Ritalin over the last decade or so. Now, why should this be? It could be that doctors are prescribing more liberally. It could be the condition is now being more recognized. Or could it just be you take a young brain with the evolutionary mandate to adapt to the environment, and if you are putting a child in a very fast-paced, exciting environment, then they will adapt to that. Now, it has to be like that, because why else should a computer screen offering only stimulation of hearing and vision in 2 dimensions, why should that outcompete a 3-dimensional real world of 5 senses? Unless what it was offering was something super normal, super bright, super interactive. And I just want to suggest that, again, this is a trend. I can't prove a causal link. We should look into this more. Could it be that we will see a decline in attention? I think we've already seen it in many things like the 30-second news and so on. Speed dating, speed this and that. This notion that you have to have something right away, you have to have it here and now, there is no delay. Could that be linked to being an environment that does give you things without delay? So effects of gaming, fragmented attention, a shorter attention span. Now, what about recklessness? Is it not a bad lesson to learn that when you play a game and someone's dead, they can become undead? Do you remember I said about when you pass the exam, you can't unpass this exam. But here, when you're in the computer world, you can reverse things. Now, if you can reverse things, I would suggest they don't have a meaning. So what would that say about you? If for a lot of your time, if 5 or 6 or more hours a day, you're doing things that don't have a meaning, what would that say about you? But more, what will it say about risk-taking in the workplace and in life generally? Now, if you ask a neuroscientist to talk about risk, we will take examples, neurological examples of brain damage where the patient presents with excessive recklessness. And the first person who did this is a very famous man called Phineas Gage, who lived in the 1860s or thereabouts in Vermont at the time of this story. You may have heard of him. He was the foreman on a railway gang at the time responsible for laying railway track from the east to the west coast. And what he was doing was pushing explosive with a so-called tamping iron, a large rod, pushing it down. And you might imagine what happened, because any story involving explosive has this outcome, sadly. The explosive went off prematurely, driving the tamping iron through the frontal part of his brain. Now, you might think this is a sad story, and why am I mentioning this? You might think he just died. Well, he's earned his place in history because he didn't die. In fact, he didn't seem impaired in any way, despite the fact he had a big hole through his head. I'm going to show you a picture of this. If you are of a squeamish disposition, again, close your eyes, and your well-meaning neighbour, who has been nudging you all along to wake up to the main points of this talk, will tell you when the slide is removed. So here it comes. So this is Phineas Gage, and you can see the dramatic injury to his brain. This part of the brain, the slide is now off, was the prefrontal cortex, an area, as its name suggests, at the front of the brain, shown here in different angles. This prefrontal cortex is very interesting. In evolutionary terms, it's very new. It occupies 33% of the human brain, but even our nearest relatives, the chimps, have only 17%. Anyone fond of cats, 3%. So we know this area is, in evolutionary terms, new, and that's actually reflected in individual development, as things often are, and that this area of the brain is only fully active in late teenage years, in the early 20s. It was on the news recently in terms of criminality of adolescence when they said, well, if this is the case, should we not revise our evaluation of criminality in adolescence if their brain is not so fully developed? That's another story. Suffice it to say, this area of the brain is very sophisticated. I myself don't like to say that brain areas have a function or this function or that. Somehow it works with the rest of the brain. It's very well connected with the rest of the brain to mediate very sophisticated mindsets. Now, there's other scenarios other than having a tamping iron through the prefrontal cortex where we can study what happens if this area is underactive. And another condition is actually in people with a high body mass index. And what's very interesting is the heavier you are relative to your height, the less active the prefrontal cortex. Now, we know that obesity and being heavy is one of the scourges of our current society. And what's very interesting is that people that are obese, as shown in this study here, are more reckless. They take more risks in gambling tasks. Now, can we put this together? Well, there's another group of people, again unrelated, who have an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex, as shown here. And these are people with schizophrenia, a very different condition entirely. But what we know about schizophrenia is it is in many respects similar to childhood. That is to say, children as schizophrenics compared to normal adults are very easily distracted. They have a much shorter attention span. They cannot interpret proverbs, rather like my little brother with the candle. If you say to a schizophrenic, what does it mean people who live in glass houses mustn't throw stones? They'll say something like, well, if you live in a house made of glass and I throw a stone, your house will break. They can't actually get the deeper meaning. And children, as I've mentioned, and schizophrenics have an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. So how can we put this together? What does eating have in common, let's say, with gambling? Well, anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating, but for obese people, the thrill of the taste of the food trumps the consequences. Anyone who gambles knows the consequences of gambling, but for compulsive gamblers, the thrill of the roulette wheel or the roll of the dice or the horse past the finishing post trumps the consequences you'll lose your money. How does this tie with schizophrenia? Well, this is a very famous series of paintings from a schizophrenic. Everyone would, you think I've got an obsession with cats, actually, it's just by chance. Everyone would recognize this as a cat, but by the time you get down to bottom right, no one would recognize this as a cat. So what's happened? Well, I'd like to suggest this gives us a clue to interpreting all these situations. Here we've gone, and this might sound familiar, from cognitive to sensory. So could it be, in these very different scenarios of gambling, childhood, eating, and schizophrenia, the common feature as related to an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex is that the senses trump the cognitive. The here and now trumps the consequences. That's one suggestion. When I said this once to a journalist, I said, are we starting to live in a world where people just say yuck and wow and live in the moment? Because I talk quite fast, she mistyped this as yucca wow. The reason I'm mentioning this is it then started a craze where there were 75,000 hits on Google in 24 hours for yucca wow, that's the thing. And moreover, someone took out the domain name, I tried, but it was too late, where they were flogging T-shirts of yucca wow. And here we have the first church of yucca wow, welcomes, and this is the point, welcomes breezy people to a world of no consequences. Yucca wow, here we are, don't have to worry about anything, just live in the moment. Now, this has always been part of the human condition. I don't know if there are any Greek scholars here. This is a picture from Euripides' Bacchae, a play that you may be familiar with from the 5th century BC, where the poor old King Pentheus here looks a bit besieged because he's about to be torn apart by these crazed women worshipping the god Dionysus. He, of course, didn't listen to the wise prophet saying that there were balanced forces in people. This notion of letting yourself go is part of our condition. We talk about having a sensational time, not just wine, women, and song, but you can let yourself go with fast-paced sports, or my favourite picture here from northern Queensland, where people have paid money to be totally out of control. This is a selling point, totally out of control. Now, this notion of living in the moment, I think, is something we acknowledge tacitly. We talk about letting yourself go, blowing your mind, losing your mind, being out of your mind. The very word ecstasy in Greek is to stand outside of yourself. And all these things are where you've abrogated the sense of self. That carefully crafted mind that we looked at earlier, of those beautiful connections, now are disabled. They're disabled because you've taken drugs that stop the chemical messengers working properly, or because the environment is coming so fast and furious, it displaces or doesn't allow time for all those checks and balances and that evaluation. What you see is what you get. You're in the moment. It's sensational. It's stimulating. If I said, okay, look, let's go out now. Let's have a cognitive time now. I don't think many people, you don't hear it often said, do you? But sensational, yes. And I think that these words have a resonance, that are not just random. Okay, so what does this say about brain states? Well, when we're in that scenario, you're very aroused and excited. In many scenarios, it becomes addictive in different ways. And by definition, it's rewarding. That's what reward looks like, in case you know. Now, in the brain, these very different conditions obviously are very complex situations, but there's one chemical that does play a very important part. It's not the only chemical, but it starts to put the brain into a state where these things are possible. And that's a chemical you will have heard of, I'm sure, called dopamine. Dopamine is active in many ways, not least in Parkinson's disease, where sadly it's deficient. But we also know that dopamine, which emanates from the primitive parts of the brain, as shown here, can have, guess what, an action on the prefrontal cortex, which we've looked at, and guess what it does? Yes, it inhibits the prefrontal cortex. So let's put that together. Could we have two scenarios for the human brain? We could call it mindless and meaningful. Strong feelings on the one hand versus thinking. Sensory versus cognitive. Living in the here and now versus a past, a present, and a future. The environment dominating, determining one moment to the next what happens as you do your downhill skiing. Here, internal perceptions dominating. Here, little meaning. What you see is what you get. A candle is a candle. A glass house is a glass house. Here, a personalized meaning. It means something other than what it literally is. Here, you've let yourself go. Here, a strong sense of identity. Here, no time and space. You're just in the moment. Here, a clear notion of episodes that have made up your life story. This mainly infants and children. This older children and adults. This with more dopamine, this less dopamine. It's been ever thus. This is what Euripides said. He didn't say about prefrontal cortex, but he was talking about wine force and bread force. So it's always been like this. But now, could we be introducing an environment that skews that balance by favouring here and now, strong stimulation, lots of interaction and excitement that doesn't require a deeper significance? Could we have a scenario where intense stimulation of the screen mandates a fast response? This makes you excited, so dopamine is released. That underlies reward-seeking and addictive behavior. Every addictive drug will cause the release of dopamine in the brain, irrespective of its initial targets. Dopamine is released, it inhibits the prefrontal cortex, bringing about scenarios such as we see with childhood schizophrenia, obesity, which, even though they're all very different situations, can be characterized by a common feature of having a sensation over cognition. And that will mean the screen appeal will be greater, and so you'll carry on. And that's a model I'd like to suggest. Okay, so fitting in with that, the Daily Telegraph a little while ago, this is, of course, sensationalist type of headline they have, but nonetheless, this is a paper showing, indeed, this area here releases dopamine, and it's larger in kids that are gaming. Now, of course, it could be a correlation. It could be, if your brain is like this, you'll be predisposed to gaming. My own view is, given the plasticity of the brain, it's the reverse. But just to show people that this is proper peer-reviewed scientific journals showing these changes, as is this one, again, from a very respectable journal, showing changes in the brain in the long term. So, could this account for the riots? In the riots, people said, many things happened in the riots, but people said they felt they were living in a video game. Look at this. Who could exult at this kind of flames going up? Could we be in a scenario where people are blurring reality with fantasy, where you're playing so many computer games, so much in that cyber world, you no longer can distinguish between the two, and you're there for the thrill of the moment because actions won't have consequences, people will be undead. Finally, the effects of search engines. I Googled on honour just for fun, because that's a very complex and nuanced, abstract term. And this is what you get, this being UK Google. Of course, you get Her Majesty comes first, and then you get these other things. Now, if you showed this to a Martian, would they know what honour was? They probably wouldn't. You can't show icons for abstract concepts. And what I fear is in the screen world, we may be losing people's sensitivity to abstract concepts. Could it be that metaphor and abstract concepts are going to be very difficult to convey to people if we just use a highly sensational, vivid screen technology? Again, yes, you can use that technology to give very fast responses to the icons, but what about meaning? What about significance? As we've just seen, if significance is derived from associations, how are you going to have that infrastructure if you come as a young kid and you're just pressing buttons and just having images come up? It and of in itself, it won't have a deeper significance. So, for example, if you play a computer game to rescue the princess, as shown here, the noble Princess Yukihime being kidnapped, do you really care about the princess? Do you care about her? Bet you don't care about her in the same way you care about Princess Maria. Now, why is the difference? What's the difference between the princesses? Well, Princess Maria has relationships just like you, and she has a past just like you, and she has a life story just like you. That's why you keep turning the pages. So she has a significance and a meaning just like you. Poor old Princess Yukihime doesn't have those things. She doesn't have a context, so she doesn't have a meaning. So therefore, she's just something you manipulate, whereas Princess Maria has a whole life. She has a sequence of events that are consequential. Do you remember I said thinking is movement confined to the brain? And this is a movement through your life or Princess Maria's life. And here, we have an unlikely champion in the chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt. I worry that the level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information, is affecting cognition. It's affecting deeper thinking. I still believe that sitting down and reading a book is the best way to really learn something. I worry that we're losing that. Chairman of Google says this. Thinking. So what is thinking? Well, here we have people who are not thinking, I don't think. They are living for the moment. We talk about that. You know, they are not, they've let themselves go. They're in a world stripped of all cognitive content. Techno, whatever it is. Sorry to the young people, I don't know what it is nowadays. But, you know, you have a world where the premium is on sensation, irrespective of the content. It's the brightness or the sounds or the smells or whatever. It is not the significance of anything. And so, as I said, let's hope this person isn't self-conscious. They don't look too self-conscious. They're not worried about the mortgage. They are just living in the moment, having a sensational time, living for the moment. We talk about living for the moment. Whereas thinking is movement. A movement is a sequence of steps that has to occur in an order. You go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Every type of thought you have, whether it's this rather interesting reasoning, starting that 2 equals 1, or whether it's a business plan, or whether it's a story, whether it's a grievance, whether it's a memory, whether it's a hope, every thought is characterized by a beginning, a middle, and end. It's a sequence. Thinking is movement, but confined to the brain. So specific sequences of symbols of sentences, these make up, in books, a story. And stories are important to us. There's stories of our lives as we evolve, as we go from childhood to courtship, to work, to retirement. Your life is a story. It's not a jumble of events. It obeys a great sequence, as we've said. You are living a narrative. You are living a unique trajectory in time and space that makes you the unique individual you are, but most important, the meaningful individual you are, because the events that have made you who you are cannot be reversed. Are we now in a culture where people are spending a lot of time doing things and being things that can be reversed? So this is a shameless plug for my 2 most recent books, which says this, available on Amazon, which articulates this in a less garbled way. Finally, how can we make up our own minds? Is this what awaits us, some dysfunctional nerd devoid of all humanity, or can we indeed reclaim a sense of humanity in a world of technology? How can we do this? What I'd like to suggest to you, it's in our hands, as shown by these rather obvious metaphors here. What I'd like to suggest is what we've been discussing is very similar to climate change. With climate change, there's many different issues, carbon sequestration, water shortages, energy problems. There's no single problem of climate change. Climate change is highly controversial. Some people think we're doomed. Some people think science can help. Some people think it's exaggerated. Climate change is unprecedented. Mind change, I'd like to call it, is similar. Many issues, as we've just skated around, from personalities and identity and empathy, through to addiction and gaming, through to knowledge versus information. All these things are separate issues that need to be unpacked and thought about. Like climate change, controversial, don't I know it? Some people think that everything's fantastic. Other people think we're inviolate in some way. Other people think we ought to intervene. Some people think it's too late. Again, a whole spectrum of views. And like climate change, mind change impacts on private and public sector, on personal lives, on our national interests and policy, and on our global well-being, just the same. In both cases, it's in our hands, what we do. But there is a big difference. With climate change, it's damage limitation, as far as I understand it. It's just putting the brakes on. But with mind change, we could actually have a fantastic opportunity if we let ourselves. I'm not suggesting we turn the clock back, far from it. We now, your kids with their long life expectancy and this brilliant technology that in our privileged society enables us to live these long and healthy lives, for the first time ever, we have this wonderful opportunity to stretch our individuality, to be unique people, to realize our true potential in a way that previous generations have not been able to do. And it's up to us to decide whether we are going to seize the moment and do this, or whether we're going to be glassy-eyed zombies saying yuck and wow. And what an irony it would be if the very technology that has given us the opportunity to be individuals at the same time enslaves us. I'd like you to leave the words with Anne herself. And you can see here, I think she has, as with many of the things she said, come up with exactly the right words. The best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quite alone with the heavens, nature, and God. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I think if one looks at the response to the lecture, I was almost thinking that so many of you would be bursting with questions to ask, and therefore I can afford to sit back and relax a little. Well, Baroness Greenfield has given us an absolutely splendid tour de force lecture on not only the physiology of the brain and how it functions and so on, but how in a profound kind of way there is an evolutionary challenge brought about not merely by the physiological factors, but the deeper cultural factors. And while listening to it, absolutely fascinating lecture, I must say I'm not a scientist, I'm a simple-minded philosopher, and I kept asking myself the following question, and I want to just share it with you. I think what I took you to be asking was that human brain seems to be undergoing some very profound changes. And even if you don't want to talk in terms of human brain changing, one could at least say that human mind which is the way in which the raw material of the brain is socially constructed. And there is a tradition of thinking in terms of which one composes categories and uses one's brain power to think and feel in a certain way. So even if one says the brain remains the same billions of cells and the same connections and so on, mind, as we have known it, is in some sense undergoing some profound changes. And I think you rightly pointed out the changes are taking place at various levels in how we process information, how we impose certain categories on the information that we have, how do we try to conceptualize it. And going a little further, the problem that arises is not merely cognitive or intellectual, it is also a moral problem in terms of empathy. And if one looks at centuries of our moral tradition, and if you were to ask yourself, why are we inclined to do good to people? Why does somebody's misery matter to me? Why do I feel that it addresses me in some way? And one can respond to it in a variety of ways. I can put myself in his shoes or her shoes and say, look, just as I was once lonely, she or he is now lonely, and therefore I begin to enter into his or her world, and that allows me to establish that bridge, that moral connection between my life and his or her life. And that is the source of empathy, empathos, a shared pathos, which over time could lead to sympathy. Now, if one's contacts with other human beings are extremely limited, or limited to what you see on Facebook and other things, does one lose this capacity to put oneself in the place of others? Because the other is always the other. One is not able to conceptualize him, relate to him, to see him in flesh and blood. And I think in some sense, as I'm sure Baroness would agree with me, in some sense this already began to happen with the rise of modernity. If you look at the rural societies or the Middle Ages, and if you read the stories of how people related to each other, how kindness and concern for each other is generated in close communities, one begins to see that with the rise of modernity in the modern state, that changes. And one largely thinks in terms of abstraction. So I care for the other person not because I can put myself in his shoes and understand what he is going through, but rather a universal statement. All human beings have certain rights. This chap is a human being. This lady is a human being. Therefore, I should treat him or her in a certain way. In other words, the concrete morality of sympathy and imagination is transfigured into a morality of a rational abstraction. And I shudder to think what it could be like, as Baroness Greenfield was saying, in 100 years' time. How would we respond to others? What would the sources of moral life be like? And I think going a little further, your last point when you were raising this question about the nature of identity, something in which I happen to have invested quite a bit of my time and written a couple of books. We human beings do want to make some sense of ourselves. And identity for us is simply not in terms of how I distinguish myself from somebody else so that I know that I'm unique, but also in terms of how these millions of little thoughts and feelings that I go through, how can I impose a certain kind of order? An order across time, order in terms of space, how do I do that? And we do that by telling stories. I am the same person who 10 years ago was doing this and 15 years ago was doing this. And that story, which we constantly retell, allows me to establish a certain sense of continuity and a certain sense of identity. We are storytelling creatures because it is through stories that we give meanings to our lives. Now, if for some reason we were to lose this capacity, and that really frightened me, if we were to lose these capacities to tell stories, what would happen to us? How would we be able to give meaning to our lives? How would we be able to construct a narrative of our life? Now, these are large questions, and I think what you have done is to alert us to those questions. Now, one response to that could be, and I'm sure some of your critics might have said this, but look, technology is neutral, let us not worry too much about it. We can do, if we can use technology in one way, we can also use it slightly differently. I don't think that would be the answer, and you will be absolutely right to say what Marx had said, although he went much further than he should have, which is that technology cannot be entirely neutral. It has its own logic. If I use a particular kind of machine, it determines the range of possibilities that are open to me. I can only do certain things and not others. And therefore, in handling man's relation to technology, we need to reject both these views, namely technology is neutral, don't worry, we can always do what we like with it. If we can use it for bad purposes, we can also use it for good purposes. But there is, and the opposite view must also be rejected, of technological determinism. Technology is going to shape us in a particular kind of way. I think by and large, one of the things that I certainly am going to take away, and along with lots of other things, is a certain refined understanding of what human capacities are like. Human capacity to think, to feel, to sympathize, to meditate, in an intellectual sense, not in a spiritual or religious sense. Human capacities arise not merely because we have certain physiological possibilities, but human capacities arise because the social relations require us to develop those capacities, without which we cannot relate to other human beings. Human capacities are like muscles. They have to be constantly exercised, because if they are not exercised, these capacities atrophy. Capacity for action, capacity to protest, capacity to think critically, to ask searching questions. These capacities are there, are developed because society requires us to develop them. Society provides institutions in terms of which we develop them. And because these tasks that these capacities perform cannot be done in any other way. Now, if you happen to have technology which can handle those tasks, why do we need to develop those capacities? If my calculator can tell me what is 20 times 20, I don't have to learn the table by heart. I don't have to do the mental work. I don't have to remember anybody's telephone number because my machine will tell me all that. So if technology can handle certain things which our society requires us to do, we don't develop those capacities. And if we don't develop those capacities, what would human beings be like? Would we be able to relate them 200 or 300 years from now? Well, you can see, Baron Greenfield, that you already have, certainly in one mind, raised some fascinating questions, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all my friends here. What a wonderful lecture it has been, and how you have given us so much to think about. I can't imagine, if reception were to take place after the lecture, I'm sure, Gillian, lots of people would want to stay and ask questions not only to the speaker, but also to discuss among themselves and break up spontaneously into little seminars and tutorials. I'm sure you would also like me to thank not only Professor David Latchman, who has been a great source of strength and inspiration, but above all to Gillian, the guiding spirit of Anne Frank Trust, the guiding spirit of this lecture series, and in general for the wonderful work, Gillian, that you have been doing over the years. So on behalf of Nirvana Foundation, on behalf of this distinguished and wonderful audience, Gillian, thank you very much. You have been a great support for all of us. Thank you.
Wow, what an evening that was, and lots of food for thought and lots of things to drive us forward with our work with young people. Gosh, what an inspiration. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Bhikkhu, for summing it up so brilliantly. Susan Greenfield would love you to get in touch with her via her website, susangreenfield.com, which is pretty ironic, but she's also here in person. So, it's been a fantastic evening, and thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at other events, lots of events coming up, and also at next year's Anne Frank lecture. Thank you.